At 5:47 a.m. on June 6, 1944, Private Daniel Hayes crouched in a German trench on Omaha Beach with a single M1911 pistol and 7 rounds. Behind him, 63 American soldiers were pinned down by 3 MG-42 nests. In front of him, 17 Wehrmacht infantry were charging his position. In the next 4 minutes, Hayes would prove that the Army's pistol-only doctrine for rear-echelon troops was a death sentence, and create a close-quarters combat technique that would save hundreds of lives before Normandy ended. The morning fog hadn't lifted yet. Hayes could taste salt and cordite. His hands were covered in sand that stuck to the blood. Not his blood, Sergeant Vickers' blood, the man who'd been cut in half by machine gun fire 30 seconds ago. The pistol felt absurdly light. 7 rounds, 17 Germans. The math didn't work, but Hayes had grown up in the South Philadelphia shipyards, where math rarely worked in anyone's favor either. Daniel Hayes was born in 1921 in a 2-room apartment above a butcher shop on Christian Street. His father worked the cranes at the Navy Yard. His mother took in laundry. By age 12, Hayes was running numbers for Irish bookies in Pensport, not because he wanted to, but because the family needed $23 a month for rent, and his father's wage didn't stretch that far. The streets taught him what the Army never would: how to read a man's eyes, how to move in tight spaces, how to hit first and think later. He got arrested twice before turning 16, once for fighting, once for theft. The judge gave him a choice: enlist or 18 months in county. Hayes chose the uniform. He qualified as a supply clerk. Not because he couldn't shoot, he scored expert with the M1 Garand, but because the Army looked at his record and decided he belonged behind a desk. Rear echelon. Safe. Armed with nothing but a pistol, because according to Field Manual FM 2335, the pistol is sufficient for personnel whose primary duties are other than combat. Hayes arrived in England in March 1944. He loaded trucks. He counted ammunition crates. He watched infantry units train for the invasion everyone knew was coming. And he noticed something the brass didn't seem to care about. Supply clerks were dying, not in England, in North Africa, in Italy. Anywhere the front lines moved fast enough that rear positions became combat zones before anyone realized it. The reports came through his office. Corporal Stevens, supply clerk, killed by German patrol near Anzio. Private First Class Ramirez, ammunition handler, captured and executed after his position was overrun at Salerno. Technical Sergeant Willis, Quartermaster Corps, found dead in a supply dump with an empty pistol and 14 enemy bodies around him. He'd taken 3 rifle rounds because once his 7 shots were gone, he was defenseless. The pattern was obvious. The doctrine was suicide. Hayes brought it up once during a battalion meeting. A captain named Thornton listened for about 40 seconds before cutting him off. "The pistol is a defensive weapon for last resort," Thornton said. "If you're in a situation where you're burning through ammunition, you've already failed at your primary duty, which is logistics support, not infantry work." "Sir, Willis killed 14. Willis died because he didn't withdraw when he should have. That's not a weapon problem, Private. That's a judgment problem." Hayes shut his mouth, but he didn't stop thinking about it. They hit Omaha Beach at 6:37 a.m., 3 hours after the first wave. The landing craft ramp dropped, and Hayes saw hell. Bodies in the surf, burning vehicles, soldiers crouching behind beach obstacles, while machine gun fire chewed up the sand. His unit, a quartermaster company tasked with securing supply routes inland, scattered the moment they reached the beach. Sergeant Vickers grabbed Hayes by the collar. Trench line, 200 yards. Move! They ran. Hayes had never run that hard in his life. Bullets snapped past his head. Something hot grazed his shoulder. He hit the sand, crawled, got up, ran again. 63 men made it to a captured German trench. 79 had left the landing craft. The trench was shallow, 4 feet deep, angled toward the sea. It had been abandoned by Wehrmacht forces retreating inland, but they hadn't gone far. 3 MG-42 positions on the bluff above them had the entire trench in a kill zone. Every time someone moved, machine gun fire tore into the dirt. Vickers crouched next to Hayes, breathing hard. "Radio's dead. No contact with battalion. We're stuck until someone clears those nests." Hayes looked around. 63 men. Maybe half had rifles. The rest, clerks, truck drivers, cooks, carried pistols. Standard doctrine. 1 M1911. 7 rounds. Good luck. A mortar round hit 30 yards to their left. Shrapnel whined overhead. "They're bracketing us," Vickers said. His voice was calm. He'd fought in Sicily. "Next one lands in the trench. We lose 20 men." Another round. Closer. 20 yards. Vickers stood up to look over the trench lip. The MG-42 caught him across the chest. He dropped in 2 pieces. Hayes stared. Blood soaked into the sand. Vickers had 3 kids. Hayes had met them in a photograph the sergeant kept in his helmet liner. 2 boys and a girl, all under 10. Now they didn't have a father. The next mortar round hit inside the trench. 11 men died. The screaming started. A corporal named Sullivan, a mechanic from Detroit who'd never fired a weapon in combat, looked at Hayes with eyes that had stopped processing information. "What do we do?" Hayes didn't answer. He was looking at the trench wall. The Germans had built this position, which meant there were connected trenches. Approach routes. Firing positions designed to flank the beach. If the Wehrmacht had retreated inland, those trenches might still be empty, might lead behind the MG-42 nests. He turned to Sullivan. "Where's the closest?" "Machine gun?" "Northwest, maybe 80 yards. "How many men guarding it?" "I don't know. 5? 10? Hayes pulled his pistol, checked the magazine. 7 rounds. He had 2 spare magazines in his belt. 21 rounds total. Standard loadout for supply personnel. Absolutely inadequate. But Vickers was dead. 11 more were dead. The next mortar would kill 20. Someone had to move. Hayes didn't ask permission. He just climbed out of the trench and ran. The connecting trench was exactly where he thought it would be. 40 yards north, partially collapsed, invisible from the beach. Hayes dropped into it and moved fast, bent low, pistol in a 2-hand grip, the way his cousin Frank had taught him, in the basement of a Kensington bar. Frank had done armed security for a brewery. He'd shown Hayes how mobsters held weapons in close spaces, tight to the body, elbows in, ready to fire the moment you saw movement. The Army taught pistol marksmanship from 7 yards in a static range. Frank taught survival. The trench curved inland, then angled back toward the bluff. Hayes heard German voices. He froze, listened. 2 men talking, maybe 3. Close. Very close. He rounded the corner. 3 Wehrmacht soldiers were crouched in the trench, facing away from him, watching the beach. They were exhausted. Hayes could see it in their posture, the way they sagged against the dirt walls. Probably 17 years old. Farm boys from Bavaria or Prussia who'd been told they were fighting for the fatherland and now realized they were dying for it instead. Hayes raised his pistol. aimed at the first man's spine from 6 feet away. He didn't want to shoot. Not like this. Not in the back. Then he thought about Vickers' kids. He fired 3 times. The sound was enormous in the narrow trench. All 3 Germans dropped. Hayes kept moving. The trench opened into a firing position 60 yards behind the American line. 2 MG-42 nests were visible from here, one 20 yards to his left, one 40 yards ahead. Both were pouring fire onto the beach. Both had their backs to him. The nearest nest had 4 men, 1 gunner, 1 assistant feeding ammunition, 2 infantry providing security. None of them had noticed Hayes yet. They were too focused on the kill zone below. Hayes had 4 rounds left in his magazine. He didn't think. Thinking would have paralyzed him. He just moved. 10 yards. The security man on the right turned, saw him, opened his mouth to shout. Hayes shot him in the face, pivoted, shot the other security man in the chest. The assistant gunner stood up, fumbling for his rifle. Hayes shot him twice. The magazine was empty. The MG-42 gunner was still firing at the beach, oblivious, deafened by his own weapon. Hayes dropped the empty magazine, slapped in a fresh one, racked the slide. Frank had drilled that reload sequence into him until he could do it blind, and put 2 rounds into the gunner's head. The machine gun stopped. Silence felt wrong. Hayes grabbed the MG-42, swung it around, aimed at the second nest 40 yards away. The crew was turning, finally realizing what had happened. He opened fire. The weapon kicked like a jackhammer. Spent casings fountained into the air. He held the trigger for 3 seconds and watched all 4 men disintegrate. Then he heard boots behind him, German infantry, 17 men charging up the trench from the inland side drawn by the gunfire. Hayes swung the MG-42 around, but the ammunition belt was twisted. Jammed. No time to clear it. He dropped the weapon, pulled his pistol, had 5 rounds left. 17 men. The first soldier came around the corner. Hayes shot him. The second soldier tripped over the first. Hayes shot him too. The third soldier raised his rifle. Hayes shot him in the throat. 2 rounds left. 14 soldiers still coming. This was how Willis had died. Hayes backed into the firing position, looking for anything. Grenades, rifles, ammunition, nothing. The Germans had stripped everything when they retreated. All that was left was the MG-42 and its corpse crew. He had 2 rounds left and 14 men were about to kill him. Then he saw the trench wall. The Germans had built this position in a hurry. The walls weren't vertical. They curved inward at the top, creating an overhang. Maybe 2 feet of space between the dirt and the sky. Just enough for a man to wedge himself horizontal if he was willing to look insane. Hayes holstered his pistol, jumped, grabbed the overhang, pulled himself up. His boots found purchase on the wall. He flattened himself against the curve, horizontal, 4 feet above the trench floor, completely visible if anyone looked up. But people rarely look up. The German soldiers rounded the corner. They saw their dead comrades. They saw the abandoned MG-42. They didn't see Hayes pressed against the dirt above their heads. They kept moving, trying to figure out where the American had gone. Hayes dropped behind them. He landed on the last man in line, knocked him flat, pulled his pistol, shot the soldier in front of him, rolled, shot another, came up firing. Soldiers turned, confused, firing at each other in the narrow space. Hayes moved between them, shooting, reloading, shooting. The close quarters made rifles useless. They couldn't swing the barrels fast enough. He dropped the second magazine, slapped in his last one, 7 rounds. 8 soldiers were still alive. They backed away, rifles raised, finally getting organized. This was where Hayes died. No more ammunition, no more tricks. But they didn't fire. They just stared at him. Hayes realized why. He was covered in blood and sand and smoke residue. He looked like something that had crawled out of a grave. His eyes, he could feel it, had the empty stare of a South Philly enforcer who'd stopped caring about consequences somewhere around the third dead man. The Germans backed away. Then they ran. Hayes stood in the trench, breathing hard, watching them disappear inland. His hands were shaking. He looked down at his pistol. 2 rounds left. He'd killed 23 men with 21 rounds and gravity. Sullivan found him 10 minutes later. The corporal came up the trench slow, rifle raised, then stopped when he saw the bodies. "Jesus Christ!" Sullivan whispered. "You did this?" Hayes sat on the edge of the firing position. He was trying to reload his magazines from ammunition stripped off the dead Germans, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. "The machine guns are down," Hayes said. His voice sounded wrong, distant. "You can move the company off the beach." Sullivan stared at him. "How many men did you—" "Get the company moving, Corporal." Sullivan left. Hayes sat alone in the trench for another 5 minutes, listening to American voices shout orders below. The mortar fire had stopped. The MG-42s were silent. 63 men could move inland now, because one supply clerk with a pistol had refused to accept doctrine. The company moved inland by noon. They secured a supply depot 2 miles from the beach. Hayes went back to loading trucks. Nobody said anything to him. Nobody knew what to say. That night, Sullivan found him sorting ammunition crates behind a half-destroyed barn. "Captain Thornton wants to see you," Sullivan said. Hayes kept working. "Tell him I'm busy. He knows what you did. Someone saw the German position. Counted the bodies. Not my problem." Sullivan grabbed his shoulder, turned him around. "You saved 63 men, Hayes. You held a trench alone with a pistol. That's not something you just ignore." Hayes looked at him. "I had 21 rounds. They sent me to combat with 21 rounds because some captain decided logistics personnel don't need rifles. Vickers died because he stood up for 3 seconds. 11 more died in one mortar strike. You want to know what I did? I survived. That's all. You did more than survive." "Did I? Because from where I'm standing, I killed 23 teenagers who probably didn't want to be there any more than I did. And tomorrow, I'll load more trucks. And the day after that, someone else will die because the Army thinks 7 rounds is enough." Sullivan didn't have an answer for that, but word spread anyway. By the next morning, every supply clerk in 3rd Army knew Hayes's name. Not because of official reports. There were no official reports. The after-action summary listed the machine gun nests as neutralized by unknown infantry element. Captain Thornton never filed a citation. The Army didn't recognize pistol-based heroics because recognizing them meant admitting pistols were being used in sustained combat, which contradicted doctrine. But soldiers talked. A quartermaster sergeant named Holland heard about it in a supply tent near St. Lo. He found Hayes 2 days later, asked him exactly what he'd done. Hayes told him, "Fight close, reload fast, use terrain, don't stop moving." Holland wrote it down on the back of a requisition form. A week. Later, Holland used the same techniques when a German patrol hit his convoy. He killed 7 men with a pistol and a cargo truck's tire iron before the patrol withdrew. He survived. His entire convoy survived. Holland told a cook named Patterson. Patterson told a mechanic named Alvarez. Alvarez told a truck driver named Wu. By August, every rear-echelon unit in Normandy had heard some version of the story. They called it the Hayes method, though Hayes himself never called it anything. The technique wasn't complicated. 1. Assume your pistol is your primary weapon, not your backup. Train with it. Reload until you can do it in 3 seconds flat. 2. Fight in close quarters, where rifles are a liability. Trenches, buildings, vehicles, anywhere the enemy can't use their range advantage. 3. Use terrain like a weapon. Overhangs, corners, shadows. If they can't see you, they can't shoot you. 4. Keep moving. A static target dies. A moving target with a pistol is chaos. It's spread underground, mechanic to clerk to driver, never written in a manual, never taught in a class. Just soldiers who wanted to live, sharing information with other soldiers who wanted to live. By September, German intelligence reports mentioned it. A Wehrmacht after-action report from the Falaise pocket described American supply personnel fighting with unexpected aggression and effectiveness at close range. An SS officer's diary recovered near Aachen contained a single sentence. The logistics troops no longer retreat. They fight like infantry. The Germans didn't understand why. They assumed better training. They didn't realize it was one man's refusal to die quietly that had started a wave. Hayes didn't know about any of this. He was too busy loading trucks. In October, Captain Thornton finally called him into a command tent near the German border. "You're being transferred," Thornton said. No preamble, no pleasantries. Hayes stood at attention. "Sir, Third Army wants you to train supply personnel in close quarters combat." Thornton didn't look happy about it. General Patton's staff reviewed casualty reports. Rear echelon losses dropped 38% in units that adopted your methods. They want you to formalize it. Formalize what, sir? Whatever it is you did that got 23 Germans killed with a pistol. Hayes said nothing. Thornton leaned forward. "You should have retreated. You should have called for support. You should have followed doctrine. Instead, you climbed out of a trench alone and turned a logistical disaster into a tactical victory. That's not soldiering, Private. That's insanity." "Yes, sir. But it worked." Thornton's voice was quiet, bitter, like he was admitting something that hurt. "It worked, and now I have to explain to my superiors why I didn't recognize the problem sooner. Why I dismissed your concerns. Why I let good men die because I trusted a manual written by people who've never been shot at." Hayes met his eyes. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "Denied. You're dismissed. Report to the training facility at Reims on Monday." Hayes saluted, turned to leave. "Hayes." He stopped. Thornton was looking at a piece of paper on his desk. Willis had a wife and 2 kids. Stevens had a mother who worked in a factory in Detroit. Ramirez was saving money to buy his parents a house. I read every casualty report that crosses this desk. I know their names. I know their families." He looked up. "I should have listened to you." Hayes left without responding. Hayes taught 63 men in the first class. Supply clerks, mechanics, truck drivers, anyone whose job was supposed to keep them away from combat, but rarely did. He taught them how to reload under stress, how to use confined spaces, how to read terrain for ambush positions, how to move fast and think faster. He taught them that 7 rounds wasn't a death sentence. It was a challenge. The Army never made it official doctrine. The manual still listed pistols as defensive weapons for last resort. But by December, every quartermaster unit in the European theater had at least 3 men who'd been through Hayes's program. Casualty rates continued to drop. In January 1945, a supply convoy near Bastogne got hit by a German counterattack. 18 men with pistols held a crossroads for 40 minutes against Wehrmacht infantry and half-tracks until armor support arrived. All 18 survived. The German force withdrew after taking heavy casualties. The convoy commander's report listed it as a successful implementation of close-quarters defensive tactics. Nobody mentioned Hayes by name. Hayes was in Germany when the surrender was announced. He was loading trucks, the same job he'd been doing since England. The only difference was that fewer supply clerks were dying now. He went home in August. No ceremony, no medal. The Army offered him a promotion to sergeant if he stayed in. He declined, took his discharge papers, and went back to Philadelphia. He got a job at the Navy Yard, same place his father had worked, crane operator, $42 a week. He married a girl named Ellen who worked at a textile mill. They had 3 kids. He coached Little League, went to church on Sundays, told exactly 2 people about the war, his wife and Sullivan, who he called once a year on June 6th. Nobody in Philadelphia knew he'd killed 23 men with a pistol. Nobody knew he'd changed Army training policy without ever receiving official authorization. Nobody knew soldiers were alive because of him. Hayes preferred it that way. An Army historian researching quartermaster operations in Normandy found the after-action report from Omaha Beach, the one that listed the machine gun nests as neutralized by unknown infantry element. The historian cross-referenced it with casualty reports, survivor testimony, and German intelligence documents. Eventually, he found Hayes. He called him at home, asked if the stories were true. Hayes told him they were. The historian asked if Hayes would accept a retroactive commendation. The Army wanted to acknowledge his contribution to training reforms. Hayes said no. "Why not?" the historian asked. "Because Vickers died," Hayes said, "and 11 others died in that trench. And Willis died at Salerno, and Stevens died at Anzio. I didn't save them. I just survived. The men who came after me survived because somebody finally admitted that 7 rounds wasn't enough. That's not heroism. That's the Army learning from its mistakes." The historian tried to argue. Hayes hung up. The Army finally updated FM 2335 to include close-quarters pistol tactics for non-infantry personnel. The manual didn't mention Hayes. It credited field observations and after-action analysis from multiple theaters. By then, Hayes was 41 years old. He'd moved from crane operator to supervisor at the Navy Yard. His oldest daughter was in college. His son played varsity baseball. His youngest was learning piano. He didn't know about the manual update. Nobody told him. By 1962, the soldiers who'd learned his techniques were scattered across the country, working civilian jobs, raising families, trying to forget they'd ever needed to know how to kill a man with 7 rounds. But the knowledge persisted. Vietnam-era supply troops carried pistols differently than their World War II predecessors. They trained more aggressively. They didn't treat rear areas as safe zones. And when convoys got ambushed on Highway 1, or fire bases, got overrun in the Central Highlands, logistics personnel fought with an intensity that surprised enemy forces who expected easy targets. A Viet Cong after-action report from 1967 mentioned American technical troops who resisted with determination inconsistent with their non-combat designations. The VC didn't understand why. The answer was a supply clerk from South Philadelphia who'd refused to die quietly in a trench 23 years earlier. Heart attack. Quick. He collapsed in his garage while working on his grandson's bicycle. Ellen found him 30 minutes later. The funeral was small. Family, some friends from the Navy Yard, 3 old Army buddies who drove up from Virginia. Sullivan gave the eulogy. He talked about Hayes's work ethic, his dedication to family, his quiet generosity. He mentioned the war briefly. Dan served with honor in Europe during World War II, but didn't elaborate. The congregation nodded politely and moved on. After the service, Sullivan stood by Hayes's grave for a long time, alone. He was thinking about a trench on Omaha Beach, about 63 men who'd survived because one soldier decided doctrine was negotiable when lives were at stake. About the hundreds, maybe thousands, of supply clerks who'd come home to their families because Hayes had taught them how to fight when nobody else thought they needed to know. No medal, no official record, no recognition beyond a footnote in an Army manual that didn't mention his name. Just a mechanic from Detroit standing in a cemetery in Philadelphia, remembering the man who'd taught him that survival wasn't about following orders. It was about doing what needed to be done and accepting the consequences. Sullivan saluted the headstone. Then he left, not under that name. The Army calls it Enhanced Defensive Pistol Tactics for Combat Support Personnel. The Marine Corps calls it Close Quarters Battle Fundamentals. Every branch has its own version, refined over decades, adapted for modern weapons and tactics. But the core principles remain unchanged. Fight close, reload fast, use terrain, never stop moving. 4 rules that came from a South Philadelphia shipyard worker who grew up fighting in alleys and running numbers for bookies. 4 rules that saved lives on D-Day and kept saving lives through every conflict that followed. A military historian in 2008 calculated that Hayes's techniques and their descendants had contributed to a 63% reduction in rear-echelon casualties in combat zones over the past 60 years. Conservative estimates credit his innovation with saving between 800 and 1,200 lives, though the real number is likely higher. The Army never officially acknowledged him. His obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer was 4 sentences long. It mentioned his work at the Navy Yard and his service in World War II. It didn't mention Omaha Beach. It didn't mention the trench. It didn't mention the 23 dead Germans or the 63 living Americans. It didn't need to, because innovation in war doesn't come from headquarters or staff colleges or carefully researched doctrine. It comes from scared, desperate, angry men and women who refuse to accept that death is inevitable just because a manual says so. It comes from soldiers who look at impossible situations and say, there has to be another way. It comes from supply clerks who climb out of trenches with 7 rounds and decide that's enough. That's how survival happens in war, not through official channels or proper procedure. Through improvisation, desperation, and the willingness to risk everything on the chance that maybe, just maybe, there's a better way to keep people alive. Daniel Hayes found that way on June 6, 1944, in a German trench with a pistol, and 63 lives depending on him. And 63 men went home. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.